Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you some ideas on how to play against the King's Indian defense. And I chose a game played by the young Garry Kasparov against Chibudanidze. Here is how this game went. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and bishop g7. This is, of course, the starting position of the kid, as we call it, the King's Indian defense. e4, d6, and here white has a ton of different choices. For example, the Zamish by playing pawn to f3, or the 4-pawn by playing f4, just to mention some of them. Of course, the main traditional move is to play knight to f3, castle, and bishop e2. And here, e5 is the main move. Black is not worried in giving this pawn up temporarily, because after pawn takes, knight takes, black could trade queens and then play either rook e8 or even knight to e4 and win the pawn back with a superior position. Typically here white does one of the following. The main move is to castle. Another option is to push the pawn to d5. Even trading pawns on e5 is not as harmless as it seems. And another very typical move is what Kasparov chose in this particular game. It was quite fashionable at that time. We're talking about 1980 when this game was played, where he played bishop to e3. The idea is to simply develop the bishop. Another idea is that after knight c6, white would immediately play d5, knight e7, and knight d2. The reason why this is important because it prevents the black knight from coming to g4. Unlike in similar variations, when, for example, after going back to this position, if instead of bishop e3, white would play castle, knight c6, d5, knight e7. If now white still wants to play knight d2, the bishop is still stuck on c1. So white would like to have the bishop on e3 and to play knight d2. But in these lines, white is a bit too slow to achieve that. So the game continued with bishop e3, and here probably the best and the main move for black today is to play knight g4, asking the bishop immediately to leave. And white typically would leave to g5, and then after f6, the bishop could go either to h4 or, surprisingly, even back to c1. The reason why white can afford moving back all the way to c1, and it's not a bad move, is because the black knight on g4 will be a little bit out of play, considering that black has already played f6. In this game, black continued by playing queen to e7, which today is considered an inaccuracy. Typically, we don't recommend early queen moves until the entire army of bishops and knights have been developed as well as the king castled. Today it's considered more ambitious and better to trade immediately on e5 and then follow it up by playing knight to d5, using the momentum that now the black queen is under attack, and then black pretty much better trades, and white would play cd5 with a superior position. At that time, this wasn't that clear because it was still a relatively unusual and new move to play Queen e7. Kasparov chose a different plan by playing d5, closing the position. Of course, by closing the position, White gains some space advantage in the center. Black now, very correctly, played knight g4, which is a typical plan to, on one hand, chase the white dark squared bishop and at the same time prepare a potential f-pawn advance to f5, which is perhaps the most typical and important plans that Black has with such a pawn structure that is so part of the King's Indian defense. Most often in such situations, the white bishop goes to g5 to gain time to attack the black queen and also trying to provoke the blocking move of f6, which in turn takes away that square from the black knight. Kasparov moved the bishop to h4, maintaining the pin over the f6 pawn. Here Black played another typical move, that is playing h5. This immediately threatens trying to trap the white bishop by playing g5 next, and when bishop retreats to g3, then advancing the h-pawn forward as well. White definitely needs to react to this, which he did by playing h3, on one hand chasing the black knight away, on another hand also clearing an escape square for the white bishop on h2. If Black would still play g5 right now, White would capture the knight, and after pawn capturing on g4, and now both white pieces are still hanging, White would capture knight takes, and the bishop simply retreating to g3, leaving White with a better position, Black having doubled pawns on the g-file and quite weak pawns at that. Let's go back to the game where Black retreated the knight as expected to h6. And now knight d2. You'll see in a minute what is White's plan. If right now Black would kind of play aggressively g5 and then followed with h4, the bishop would conveniently hide on h2, and Black playing f5, Black would get active play but would be a bit weak on the light squares. White would trade and then follow up by playing bishop to d3, and one of the knights soon will occupy the e4 square. Of course, the game would be still very complex, but White would be slightly better. Instead, the game continued in this position by Black playing c5. This move keeps the position closed in the center and somewhat on the queen side. White continued by playing knight to f1. And at this stage, Black should have played the same plan we mentioned a minute ago, playing g5 and then h4 and then f5. That was the best chance that Black had. Another plan Black could have considered was to play knight a6 followed by knight to c7 and bishop d7 developing. Black instead made a mistake, played a natural move, trying to get his other knight into the game, playing knight f7. And this is an idea that I definitely wanted to share with you because it's very typical. On one hand, you see that the white king has not castled yet. So this is an exception from the general rules and concepts to castle as soon as you can. In fact, in this variation, in this type of position, because the center, the middle of the board is so closed on the C, D, and E files, pawns plugged in to each other, White can afford to delay or avoid castling altogether. And it's very typical that white would play g4 in such situations to make it real difficult for black to play f5. And this is what Kasparov played in this position too. Black traded pawns on g4, but let's talk for a moment about what would happen if black instead would try to close off the position completely with these pawn moves. Well, white would still maintain the advantage after these above moves because the white knight would appear on e3, and then when the black knight arrives on f4, just on time, the white bishop would retreat to f1, protecting the pawn on h3, followed by the plan of retreating the other bishop to g1, then playing rook h2, and developing play on the queen side, on the b file, playing a3 and b4, and swinging the rook from h2 over to b2, doubling rooks, and white would still have a very pleasant position. Let's go back to the game. Although, as you'll see what happened in the game, probably black is sorry he didn't rather close the position. Came h takes g4, and the bishop took on g4. Typically, in this pawn structure, where the center is so closed off, the bad bishop that black has is on g7, and white's light-squared bishop is considered the bad bishop because it is greatly limited by his own chain of pawns on the light squares. So therefore, it's an achievement for white to trade the light-squared bishops. Black played g5, white traded bishops on c8, and black recaptured. And this is the key moment of the game. If right now white would respond with a natural retreat of the bishop, black all of a sudden would get activity by sacrificing a pawn with f5, followed by playing e4. Very typical ideas in the King's Indian. Oftentimes, black is happy to sacrifice a pawn to achieve activity, such as, for example, as we see here, opening of the long diagonal for the bishop and clearing some important square for his knight on e5. So in this case, for white, it's more important to prevent black's counterplay rather than winning material. In fact, white happily sacrifices material, as you'll see Kasparov's brilliant move playing knight to e3. And indeed, black accepted the challenge and sacrificed, and the sacrifice, and now came knight f5, attacking black's queen. Queen d8 and queen g4. White is ready for the attack, even though black is a full bishop ahead, cannot celebrate because white's attack is pretty much undefendable. Now white calmly and slowly captures the pawn, rook c7, and the knight retreats to its beautiful position on f5. Game a6 and h4. Chasing the knight out of the way, knight h7, rook g1, attacking the pinned bishop a third time, and black still is hanging on. And now just really slowly, white keeps improving his position while preventing black's counterplay on the queen side. King e2, getting ready to double rooks on the g file. Black played rook a7, trying to get more defense on the 7th rank to the bishop on g7. a4, preventing any thought of counterplay by playing b7 to b5. Game b6. Queen h5. King h8, getting out of the pin. And rook g6, getting ready to double the rooks. Black is pretty helpless, can only make waiting moves. Rook A to G1, Rook A to B7, Queen G4. So now white has all of the 4 pieces pressuring that bishop that has no moves. The knight on H7 has no moves, neither does the knight on B8. Pretty sad picture for black. Black can only make waiting moves. Rook G2, and white can optimize the position of all his pieces. As we see, black is just waiting around. And now, finally, white brings his last piece to the attack. Knight E2. On one hand, the knight may show up through G3 on H5, and on another hand, white is preparing also the pawn advance to F4. Black responded by playing Queen C8, kind of pinning the knight on F5. Black, of course, would be glad if white captures on D6 and finally trade queens and get off the pressure a little. But white plays better than that, played F4. If black trades now on F4, the white knight appears there, and then the knight will get to either E6 or H5, and that would be quite devastating for black. Finally, black got tired of just waiting around and played B5, hoping for some counterplay. White simply captured, and black played Rook A B7, attacking that pawn. And here we go with the H-pawn. Now that white has a pawn on F4, that makes sure that the black knight will not show up on G5. That's the reason why white didn't want to play H5 earlier. Black played knight to F8, trapping the white rook on G6, but white is not too concerned about it and not too disappointed. The queen moved to H3. The threat obviously is to advance the pawn and trap the bishop. Black captured the rook on G6, but that meant that it's discovery after the recapture, check. King G8, and white gained the sacrificed rook back. If now the rook captures on F7, white would just play knight H6, and the black queen would be hanging on C8. Came King F8, and now white just captured the bishop, and black resigned as the checkmate is around the corner on H8. So what did we learn from this game? Well, we saw an interesting opening idea how to play against the king's Indian defense. Next to the different opening choices, such as fianchettoing your own white bishop on G2, or playing the Zamish or the fawn pawn attack, you saw this alternative to play the main line with knight F3, bishop E2, and then on move 7, bishop E3. Bishop E3, it's a normal developing move, and the idea is that if black plays knight C6, you close the center immediately and get your knight to D2, which is a typical plan, while preventing the black knight from moving to G4. Going back a little bit to the opening stages of this game, I'd like to mention that after the position gets closed in the center, typically, white's plan is to open the C file on the queen side, and black's counterplay usually comes on the king side by playing F7 to F5. The other idea of this variation is not to determine which side of the board the white king castles to. There are situations, especially when the position in the middle of the board is closed, where the white king actually ends up castling to the queen side to avoid black's attack on the other side of the board. The main challenge, of course, today is if black immediately goes and chases the bishop with knight g4. Nevertheless, I think even today this line is very well playable for both sides, and it's a bit less known than some other more popular lines today. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. As usual, I suggest before you listen to any further commentary or explanation of this endgame, you try to figure out for yourself what's going on. As usual, it's white to move. To give you a little hint, it's white to move and win. At this position, black is an exchange up, but white has 2 extra pawns, and one of the pawns is far advanced. However, that far advanced pawn on f6 is actually ready to be caught by the black king, which stands right there on the h5. So if white advances the pawn to f7, black can simply move king g7. Nevertheless, this is the correct first move. Well, the second move is also not that difficult, playing knight f5 check. Well, it's easy to see that if king takes pawn right now, then the white knight will end up on d6, giving a fork, winning the black rook. But what happens if right now the black king simply moves to f8? Then, amazingly, white simply moves his pawn on b2 away from the attack, playing b4. And by doing that, puts black in a zugzwang. Amazing. If king takes pawn, again knight d6 fork, and anywhere the black rook would end up moving to, the rook would be lost. Quite impressive, isn't it? Well, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you gained some important ideas in the King's Indian for both sides actually, not just from the white perspective. If you don't play d4 on move 1, maybe you play the King's Indian against the queen pawn start. And then you saw how not to play. And remember, the best idea for black against the bishop e3 move is to play knight g4 right away. And of course, this final endgame was very cute. And remember, zugzwang is a very important element in endgames. I'm hoping that with these beautiful endgame positions or jewels of the week, I give you some creative ideas that in simple looking positions also look for the beauty in chess. Thanks for listening, and so long until next week.